Hi boys and girls, it's Mrs. Bowie and Dighton here for the time being until he sees something exciting and runs off. I was thinking about the book of Fireflies from a Making Meaning lesson where we talked about show and not tell, and it reminded me about one of my favorite authors, Patricia Polacco, and she has a story about fireflies. And I just wanted to read that to you for fun. It's called When Lightning Comes in a Jar. Come to a family reunion. When lightning comes in a jar. Today is my family reunion. I can hardly wait. My dad's side of the family will be coming soon. It's been ages since we've seen them all. Before our reunions, we were always at my grandma's house, but this year it was going to be at mine. I'm so anxious to see my cousins, especially Lydia and Sandy. They will be wearing the same colors that we always wear at family reunions. They wore them at our last reunion. How I remember that day. Grandma and I stood at her front window waiting for the relatives to come. I can't wait to see them all, I said to her. I know, she answered. Will there be jello like always? I asked. Yes, she answered. And baseball and croquet like there always is? A bag race too? And will you tell stories like you always do? Might, Grandma said, looking up at the sky. And we might catch lightning in a jar. Lightning in a jar, I asked. Is that new? And then my relatives started driving up by the carload, one after another. Finally, the car I was waiting for rolled up with my 5 cousins, and they all piled out. Sandy and Freddie and Billy and Lydia and Carl. Sandy, Lydia, and I squealed and ran from the porch to the swing, just like we always did. We held hands and pushed the swing with one of our bare feet. We told secrets that we had kept for a whole entire year. I told them about the lightning jar. When my dad called out, "Who's going to unload these baskets from the car?" we shouted. "We will." And we lugged baskets full and heavy to the tables in the maple grove. Wonder how many jello salads there will be, my cousin Freddie asked. Gazillions, there are always, my cousin Billy answered. Sure enough, there were gazillions. They jumped and shook every time we bumped the table. They seemed alive. Bet there are as many meatloafs too, my brother chimed in. There they were as we unpacked them, zillions of meatloafs. They were different too. Each auntie had their own recipe, including Aunt Bertha, who made one with hard-boiled eggs in the middle. Ooh. When we cut it, there was a perfect slice of egg, like a giant eye. Our auntie and grandma fitted around the tables like butterflies going from flower to flower. They perked up the lettuces or rearranged the tomatoes and set slices of meatloaf so they looked perfect. When Grandma and the aunties took off their aprons, we all knew it was time to gather at the table. We all held hands. Uncle Waylon said the blessing. Then everyone sat down and dove into the food, piling it high on their plates, some as high as haystacks. My brother Richie was sitting with some older girls that came with our older cousins. He was acting silly. I could tell he liked one of them. Embarrassing. When we thought we couldn't eat any more, Grandma and my aunties put their aprons back on and started getting all of the pies and the cakes from the kitchen. There was something magical about my grandma and her sisters this day. They knew something like they weren't telling. I did wonder how Grandma was going to catch lightning in a jar, and every so often I'd stop to ask her how. She would just smile and say, "Easy, someday you'll do it too." After we ate, it was time for our annual baseball game, my dad and uncles against the kids. "Batter up," my dad called out as my cousin Billy stepped up to home plate. Lucky he was on our team. He could hit anything. When he was out in the field, he'd leap into the air and make impossible catches. That kid can jump higher than a cow's back, our uncles used to say. First pitch out, Billy hit the ball so hard it clean disappeared. We thought it was lightning as it hit the sky. Maybe the lightning was on its way. Was that what Grandma was going to catch in a jar? I'm going to be a Detroit Tiger someday, Billy said that day. We all knew that he most certainly would. Next, it was time for croquet, the biggest game of the day, which our uncles kept interrupting with friendly quarrels about bent hoops, crooked wickets, and wanting to take reshots. We had bag races, watermelon seed spitting contest, and rides on Grandpa's draft horse too, until Grandpa waved a yardstick in the air. All of us kids dropped what we were doing and we ran to the milk shed. We knew it was time to get measured. We did this every year. I like looking at the marks that my grandma and her sisters and brothers on the same doorway, some shorter than mine. Hard to imagine that once they were little just like me. Aunt Bertha had gone to the house and fetched all the family portrait albums. The auntie showed us old brown photos and pointed. That was their father, who saved souls as a circuit preacher when he wasn't farming. Look, there were their favorite horses. Their eyes sparkled when they showed us their wedding pictures. Their aunties were all married and at their mother's parlor. I watched Grandma to see if she would summon the lightning from the sky. It's time for our family photo, Aunt Iva called just as she jumped up and grabbed her camera. We kids didn't like this part because it meant that any dirt on our face would be scraped off with a hanky that our aunties had spit on, especially mine. Everybody smile, Auntie said. After this, the kids started to chant, "Stories, stories, stories, please!" Grandma and her sisters and her brothers stared quiet and slow. Then Uncle Ernest told about milking cows faster than lightning. Grandma told about how she and her sisters walked 7 miles to a one-room schoolhouse over in Lock Center, and how each of them taught in the same school. Then there was some quiet as Aunt Iva started fanning herself. We knew she was getting ready. I remember the day that I was driving the rig home from school when I came upon a real rattlesnake. Well, we all looked at one another. Rattlers weren't around these parts, so we knew this was going to be good. That thing was all coiled up and shaking its tail. Not a rattling sound, something more like a loud buzz. Belle, the horse, just stood there and shook. "What did you do, Aunt Iva?" we asked. "Well, sir, I stepped out of the buggy, took my umbrella, and put a smack in the middle of that snake all coiled up. It just wrapped all around the umbrella. I knew if it struck me, it was a goner." We all leaned forward, so I picked it up, gave the umbrella a sharp jerk, and flung the snake into Cecil Potter's field. Then I jumped onto my buggy and galloped home like the wind. All of my aunties and uncles laughed. Then a flicker of heat lightning sprang out of the horizon. The air didn't move. Was some magic going to happen? Aunt Ella flashed her fan. We knew she was getting ready to top Aunt Iva's story. Have I ever told you children about the time I took a ride on the first newfangled motor car here in this country? No, the kids sang out. Well, sir, it belonged to Eddie Dunkel. My pa didn't approve of him. No, never, no how. He's a wild kid, he'd rave. Don't ever want to see you with the likes of him. Then one day when I was walking home from a prayer meeting, he rolled up next to me, driving the shiniest machine that I had ever seen. Aunt Ida stopped and fanned some more. "What happened, Aunt Ida?" we begged. Well, Aunt Ida crowded. "I climbed right into that thing. Eddie shifted the contraption, made a terrible sound, and that roadster almost leaped right out from under us. It went so fast my hat blew clean off. We were going almost 40 miles an hour. We raced up Moyer Road, hurtled around Evie Peters' barn, almost flattened the Bender Sister fruit stand, and howled down Dighton Road. We gasped. And when we skipped to a stop in front of Pa's barn, there he was just a-standin'. She stopped again and fanned herself. "What did he do, Aunt Ida? What happened?" we all pleaded. "Not a blessed thing," she answered, and laughed so hard she almost dropped her lemonade. Heat lightning flickered. There was a low rumble of thunder off in the distance. Now I watched my grandmother. She smiled and gave me a wink. It was her turn. "Well, sir," Grandma began, "I was but a girl, out plowing, helping Pa in the fields. His team could put those rows straight as an arrow. When the team reared and bolted and dragged me halfway down the field before I could free myself. When I stood up, there was a fierce clatter and a roar in the sky above me. We all leaned forward. It was like thunder and fierce lightning. She stopped and sipped her lemonade. "What was it, Grandma?" the kids begged her. I looked up, waiting for the lightning. "Well, sir, I couldn't believe what I was seeing above me." She crawled close to her knee. "There, like a giant dragonfly, with 2 sets of wings, glowing and roaring and pitching and rolling, spewing foul-smelled smoke." She leaned forward. It was the first ever flying machine in the state of Michigan. We all clapped with delight. That would have been a perfect time for the lightning to come, but it didn't, and it was almost dark. I whispered to Grandma, "What about the lightning in the jar?" She adjusted her glasses and gave me a look. "Have the last ray of sun left the grass?" she asked. I looked real hard. "Yes," I said. "Then sit down, child." Aunt Bertha brought a wicker laundry basket full of glass canning jars and set them at Grandma's feet. "Many years ago, when your aunties and uncles and I were but children, our grandpa showed us what we are about to show you." She leaned down and touched the grass, cupping something with her hands. She thought for a moment and then said, "Shadows lengthen, the day near done, birds fly low at setting sun. Stars will rise from earth below, in these hands their light will glow. Come up, lightning, come up, stars, we'll snatch you up in these here jars." She blew into her hands and let something go. It flew for a moment and then landed deep in the grass. We watched and watched, but nothing was happening. Low thunder rumbled just above us. "Look," my cousin Billy called out. A small burst of starlight puffed out of the grass. Then more and more drifted out of the carpet of lawn beneath our feet. "Fireflies," we all called out. We grabbed the jars and the dash was on to capture Grandma's lighting and put it in a jar. Grandma gave me a knowing look and smiled. When everyone had gone home that night, Grandma and I sat on the porch swing together. We looked at the flickering jar, and even though the fireflies are common in Michigan on summer nights, never had I seen so many as that night. And as long as I live, I'll believe that somehow Grandma called them up with her stories and her magic. That night seems so long ago, but the reunion is here again. My family's arriving now. My heart is racing. We'll eat scrumptious jello and meatloaf and play baseball and croquet, spit watermelon seeds, and scroll new measurements on the milk house door jamb. We'll look at photo albums, we'll laugh and cry at others. Well, we'll remember the stories, how Grandma saw the first flying machine, Aunt Iva conquered the Rattler, and we'll talk about Billy and how he should have been on the Detroit Tigers, but gave his life for his country in a war far away. Then, when the sun is low and the shadows long, we'll all sit and fan ourselves in the shade of the maple trees. Only a new crop of children will gather at our knees. My father, my grandmother, my aunts, and my uncles are no longer here. So now it will be us who will tell their stories and bring them back for fleeting moments. Then I will show the children the magic that Grandma showed me. I'll call the stars from beneath their feet, and as they rise in the warm night air, these children will leap as high as a cow's back to gather them. I'll send them home with full bellies, tired bones, flickering jars in their laps. Their hearts will be overflowing, full of lightning, put by folks who loved them even before they were born. Grandma knew this well. She also knew that someday they would tell their children about all of us and of the magic nights we caught lightning in a jar. I just thought that would be fun, being we read the other story about fireflies, and this story was a connection for me. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. Have a good night.